Linda set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast on the table in front of Ethan. "Eat up, sweetheart, the kitchen had extras again," she said with a small nod. But what happens when 4 black SUVs pull up outside the diner? Find out on Courageous Voices. The sun was just beginning to rise over Maplewood, casting a soft glow across the sleepy town. Inside the Maplewood diner, the smell of fresh coffee, bacon, and buttermilk pancakes filled the air. Linda Parker, 66, tied her apron with practiced hands and moved through the narrow aisles between booths, greeting the early morning regulars. "Morning, Joe," she said, setting a steaming mug of black coffee in front of an older man near the window. "Morning, Linda, looks like it'll be a cold one," Joe replied, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Wouldn't be October in Maine without it." Linda smiled, already moving on to refill another cup. The bell above the door jingled again, and Linda glanced up, expecting to see Ed from the hardware store, or maybe young Hannah on her way to the bakery shift, but instead, her eyes landed on someone unfamiliar. A small boy, maybe 9 years old, stepped inside, the chill of the morning clinging to his worn jacket. His backpack, too big for his narrow shoulders, dragged slightly behind him. Without a word, he shuffled to the corner booth, the one furthest from the door, and slid in. Linda watched from behind the counter as the boy settled, pulling out a well-worn book with frayed corners, his head bent low, his small hands smoothing the pages. When the waitress approached with a menu, he shook his head. "Just water, please," he murmured, eyes flicking up only briefly. Linda nodded. "You got it, honey." She filled a glass, adding a paper straw, and brought it to his table, setting it down gently. The boy muttered a faint thank you before hunching over his book again. Back behind the counter, Linda watched him out of the corner of her eye. She saw the way his shoulders tensed whenever the door opened, the way his eyes darted toward the kitchen every time someone's plate came out, piled with eggs, bacon, or pancakes. She had seen that kind of quiet hunger before, once in her younger self years ago when money was tight and pride was tighter. Without saying a word, Linda slipped into the kitchen. "Tom," she called to the cook, "we had an extra order of toast come up, right?" Tom, flipping an omelette, raised an eyebrow. "Did we?" "We do now," Linda said with a small smile. Moments later, she brought a plate of toast and set it on the boy's table. "Looks like the kitchen goofed again," she said casually. "Shame to let it go to waste." The boy looked up, his eyes darting between the plate and Linda's face. For a heartbeat, suspicion flickered in his expression, then hunger overrode it. He gave a nearly invisible nod, and his hands reached for the toast. Linda turned back to the counter, pouring another cup of coffee for Joe, but her eyes drifted toward the corner booth again. For the first time that morning, she felt the quiet warmth of doing something right, no matter how small. Curious about how this small act of kindness changes everything? Stay tuned to Courageous Voices for the incredible twist. By the end of the first week, Linda had learned the boy's routine. Every morning just after 7, the diner door would creak open, the bell giving a soft jingle, and there he'd be Ethan, as she had quietly begun calling him in her mind, though she still hadn't asked his name. Same worn jacket, same oversized backpack, same tattered book pressed close to his chest. He'd slip into the corner booth and order a glass of water, nothing more. Linda quickly made sure the kitchen always had an accidental order waiting. Some mornings it was oatmeal with brown sugar and raisins, other days it was a small plate of scrambled eggs or a short stack of pancakes with a pat of butter melting on top. She made it a point to drop the plate at his table with a light tone. "Tom got distracted again," she'd say with a slight shrug. "Figured you could help us out." At first, Ethan hesitated, eyes flicking nervously around the diner as if waiting for someone to stop him, but slowly, day by day, that hesitation faded. By the second week, he was already reaching for the fork before Linda had even turned back to the counter. The regulars at Maplewood Diner were not blind. Joe, sitting near the window, noticed first. "Looks like you've got a new helper back there," Joe remarked one morning as Linda topped off his coffee. Linda followed his gaze to the corner booth. "Yeah, seems like it." "Quiet kid," Joe mused, polite, though. By the third week, the whispers had started. "Is that the same boy every morning?" murmured Margaret, who ran the flower shop down the street, as she handed over her breakfast check. "Linda's got herself a charity case," Ed from the hardware store said under his breath to another customer, watching as Linda placed a plate of pancakes in front of Ethan. Even Tom the cook raised an eyebrow one morning. You're running quite a tab for that kid, you know. Linda just waved him off. Don't worry about it, Tom, I'll handle it. But the comments didn't stop. Careful, Linda, Margaret warned one morning as she slipped into her usual booth. You start giving too much away, they'll come to expect it. Kids these days, Ed muttered the next day, shaking his head. Back when I was his age, you didn't eat if you didn't earn it. Linda kept her lips sealed, brushing away the remarks like crumbs off the counter. What did they know? They hadn't seen the tight knot of Ethan's shoulders when he first sat down, they hadn't noticed the way his eyes stayed on his plate as if afraid someone might snatch it away, they hadn't seen how the simple act of sliding a plate of food in front of him slowly transformed him from a boy on edge to one who could, just for a moment, sit and eat without looking over his shoulder. As Linda worked the counter or delivered plates to other tables, she often caught herself glancing over at Ethan. She never hovered, she never asked questions, she simply made sure that when he was there, he was fed. She thought often of her own childhood, of those hard winters when her parents struggled to keep the heat on, when neighbors sometimes slipped a bag of groceries onto their back porch. She remembered the shame she'd felt back then, the quiet, gnawing hunger, the constant feeling of being one step away from losing everything. It wasn't charity, she told herself now, it was just human. Over the weeks, something subtle shifted. Ethan, though still quiet, began to change in small ways. His eyes met hers for a moment longer when she brought his plate, his shoulders relaxed, he even gave a brief, almost imperceptible smile. One morning, when she set down a plate of oatmeal topped with fresh berries, Linda noticed. She noticed everything, and though the town whispered and gossiped and sometimes judged, Linda didn't waver. She pulled a few dollars from her tips each night to cover the cost of the meals. She tucked away her own needs, the new winter coat she'd been eyeing, the overdue dentist appointment, and put the boy first, because to Linda, the world had enough people asking questions, setting conditions, and measuring worth. She had decided long ago that in her little corner of the world, some things like a hot meal, a full belly, and a quiet place to read didn't come with strings attached, and in the end, that was enough. It was a Thursday morning when the pushback finally arrived. Linda had just dropped off Ethan's usual plate of pancakes, kitchen mix-up again, and was pouring coffee for Joe when she heard Tom's familiar voice behind her. Linda, he called from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel, can I see you for a minute? Linda set the coffee pot down and followed him into the back. Inside the small office, Tom leaned against the cluttered desk, his face tight. Look, Linda, we need to talk. She crossed her arms loosely, waiting. You know, I've got nothing against you helping folks, Tom began, but people are noticing that kid's been in here every day for weeks now, and every day you're giving him free food. Linda opened her mouth, but Tom held up a hand. Don't get me wrong, I admire your heart, but this is a business, not a soup kitchen. Word gets around that we're handing out meals, and next thing you know, we've got every hard luck case in town lined up at the door. Linda gave a quiet nod, thinking. Here's the deal, Tom continued, softening slightly, I can't have the diner covering it, but if you want to pay out of your tips, that's your call. Linda's eyes met his, steady and sure. That's fair, Tom, just one meal a day, I'll handle the cost. Tom gave a resigned sigh. All right, but if it starts interfering with work or if he causes trouble, we'll have to rethink. Linda smiled faintly. No trouble, you'll hardly know he's here. With that, she slipped back into the front where Ethan sat hunched over his book, carefully picking at his pancakes. As Linda cleared nearby tables, she felt a small knot of relief loosen in her chest. For now, the quiet arrangement could continue, but the town was already buzzing. The first photo appeared on Facebook over the weekend, a snapshot of Ethan's empty booth with a plate of half-eaten toast. The caption read, Maplewood Diner, free meals for strays. By Monday, the post had multiplied. One read, nothing like rewarding freeloaders. Go, Linda. Another chimed in, she's always been soft, bless her heart, but this is why people take advantage. Linda heard the whispers when she walked home from work. At the grocery store, she caught the sideways glances. Even in the diner, some customers snickered behind their menus. Careful, Linda, Margaret warned one morning, sipping her coffee, the town's got a long memory. Linda forced a small laugh, brushing it off. People will talk, Margaret, that's their hobby. But alone at night in her small home above the pharmacy, the weight settled differently. She would slip out of her work shoes, fix herself a cup of tea, and sit in the armchair by the window, and sometimes, when the silence pressed too hard against her, she would reach for the old shoebox on the bookshelf. Inside were her husband's letters, yellowed with age, the handwriting familiar and dear. Jack had been gone for years now, claimed by a heart attack that gave no warning, but his words lived on in These letters written during his deployment in the army. She unfolded one, smoothing the creases. "Lynette," he began, using the nickname only he had called her. "Sometimes the smallest things remind me why we serve. A man sharing half a sandwich, a stranger offering a blanket on a cold night. I see dignity in those moments, dignity that no uniform or medal can give." Linda traced the lines with her finger, her throat tightening. Outside, the town moved on. People rushed home from late shifts. Porch lights blinked on somewhere. A dog barked at the night. Linda folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. She thought of Ethan, of the way his eyes never quite met hers, of the way his shoulders had eased just a little in recent weeks. She thought of the townspeople in their judgment, of the thin line between dignity and need, and of how quickly people forgot what it meant to struggle. She rose, set her empty mug in the sink, and looked out the window one last time before bed. The street below was quiet, the diner dark across the road. Tomorrow morning, she knew the door would jingle at 7:15, and Ethan would slip inside, book in hand, and Linda would be ready with a plate of something warm. No questions asked, let them talk. The first morning Ethan didn't come in, Linda barely noticed. She kept glancing at the door between coffee runs, but the minutes slipped past. 7:15, 7:30, 7:45, and his usual booth sat empty. She shrugged it off, telling herself he was probably running late or maybe home with a cold. Still, without thinking much, she had the kitchen make up a small plate of pancakes and set it at his usual table just in case. The plate sat there until closing time. By the second day, a quiet knot had settled in Linda's chest. She tried not to hover by the window or glance at the clock every few minutes, but it was impossible to ignore the hollow space in the corner booth. Again, she brought out a plate, scrambled eggs and toast this time, and left it on the table. Again, no one came to claim it. On the third day, Tom poked his head out from the kitchen as Linda wiped down Ethan's table. "Linda," he said softly, "maybe don't waste the food today." She gave a brief nod, but an hour later, there was a plate of oatmeal waiting in that corner, the chair still pulled slightly out as if expecting someone to slide in. By the end of the week, the regulars had noticed. Margaret gave her a pitying look as she handed over her check. "He's probably moved on, dear, you did what you could." Ed, on the other hand, smirked over his coffee. "Told you so, Linda, strays don't stick around once the handouts dry up." Linda forced a smile she didn't feel and went back to wiping down the counter. Inside, the doubts were piling up. Had she been foolish all along? Had she crossed some invisible line, offered too much, expected too little in return? She'd never asked his name, never asked where he came from, or if anyone was looking for him. She had only offered food, a quiet place to sit, and now it felt like she'd been feeding a ghost. Nights grew longer, colder. Linda still couldn't help herself. Each morning, she slipped a small plate onto the table, then watched it go cold hour after hour. Finally, on the 10th day, she set the plate down with a long breath and just stood there, hand on the back of the chair, staring at the empty booth. Behind her, Joe's voice came softly, "You've got a good heart, Linda, don't let the world take that from you." She gave him a quiet nod, blinking back the sting in her eyes. That night, as she locked up the diner and crossed the street to her apartment, the town around her was hushed, porch lights dimmed, windows glowing faintly against the dark. She wondered where Ethan was now. She wondered if he was safe, if he was warm, if he had someone waiting for him. Above all, she wondered if kindness had ever really been enough. The 11th morning dawned colder than usual, the kind of sharp autumn chill that slipped under doors and through coats. Linda Parker wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck as she unlocked the Maplewood diner. She hesitated at the door, glancing down the street as if half expecting to see a small figure with a worn backpack coming around the corner, but there was no Ethan. With a sigh, she went inside, flipped the sign to open, and began her morning ritual, wiping down counters, prepping coffee, setting out the silverware. Still, by force of habit, she laid out a plate at the corner booth, a small stack of pancakes with a pat of butter, a glass of milk, and a fork resting neatly on a napkin. "Linda," Tom called softly from the kitchen, "you sure you want to keep doing that?" She only gave him a faint smile. "Just one more day, Tom." By 7:15, the regulars had trickled in, Joe with his black coffee, Margaret ordering her usual oatmeal, Ed reading the paper at the counter, the usual clatter of forks, the soft murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, and then the bell above the door jingled. But it wasn't Ethan. Instead, a hush spread across the diner like a wave rolling through the room. People turned toward the window as 4 large black SUVs pulled into the lot outside, moving with slow, deliberate precision. The engines cut off, and doors opened in near-perfect unison. Men stepped out, tall, uniformed, their boots striking the pavement with practice steps. Linda's heart gave a hard thud. The lead car opened, and a man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a military uniform heavy with ribbons and medals. His face was lined, his posture straight as a beam. He paused at the door, adjusted his cap, and stepped inside. The bell jingled again, unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Tom poked his head out from the kitchen, his face pale. The regulars froze mid-bite, coffee mugs halfway to their lips. The officer's eyes swept the room, calm and precise. Before landing on Linda, he walked forward with measured steps, stopping at the counter. "Ma'am," he said, voice steady, "are you Linda Parker?" Linda opened her mouth, but her voice caught in her throat. She managed a quiet, "Yes, I am." He reached into his breast pocket and drew out an envelope, crisp and formal. "I'm Colonel Marcus Daniels, U.S. Army Special Forces," he said. "I'm here because of a promise made to one of our own." Linda felt her knees weaken. She gripped the edge of the counter as the room seemed to narrow around her. The colonel nodded gently toward the corner booth. "You've been feeding Ethan Miller, haven't you?" Linda's heart stumbled. "Ethan?" "Yes, is he?" "He's safe," the colonel assured her quickly. "He's with his grandparents now in Colorado, but I'm here on behalf of his father, Master Sergeant Daniel Miller. He was deployed overseas. He didn't make it home." Linda's breath hitched. The colonel continued, his voice thickening slightly. "In his last letter, Sergeant Miller asked that if anything happened to him, we find the woman who made sure his son wasn't hungry, that we thank you properly." He held out the envelope. Linda took it with trembling hands, the weight of it almost too much to bear. Behind the colonel, the soldiers outside turned toward the window. One by one, they raised their hands in a crisp salute. Inside, the regulars rose to their feet in stunned silence. Joe stood, his coffee forgotten. Margaret's eyes shone with sudden tears. Even Ed lowered his paper, his mouth tightening into a hard line. For a long moment, Linda just stood there, envelope in hand, a lifetime of quiet mornings and unnoticed kindness gathering into this one moment. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't do much, I couldn't let him go hungry." The colonel gave a faint, solemn nod. "Sometimes," he said softly, "that's everything." For a long moment, the diner remained frozen. Linda stood behind the counter, fingers trembling around the crisp envelope, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room could hear it. Colonel Daniels held her gaze, then stepped back. Behind him, the other soldiers moved in unison, straightening their shoulders. "Ma'am," the colonel said, his voice steady, "on behalf of the United States Army Special Forces, the brothers in arms of Master Sergeant Daniel Miller, and most importantly, on behalf of his son, Ethan, we thank you." Without another word, he raised his hand in a sharp, precise salute. The officers behind him followed. Through the diner window, Linda saw the soldiers outside doing the same, their silhouettes outlined against the gray morning. Inside the diner, no one spoke. Chairs scraped softly as Joe rose to his feet, his weathered hand pressing against the table as he stood. Margaret followed, then Ed, then every customer in the room, all rising, all watching, some with hands pressed to their chests, some with tears brightening their eyes. For years, Linda Parker had been invisible in her own town, the woman who poured coffee, swept crumbs from booths, and quietly made sure no one sat hungry. Now she stood at the center of a moment she never could have imagined, holding a letter from a man she had never met, who nonetheless knew her heart. Linda felt the envelope's weight in her hands. More than paper, it was gratitude wrapped in sacrifice, in the last words of a father thinking of his son and the stranger who had shown him quiet mercy. Her throat tightened as she finally found her voice. "I didn't do it for thanks," she whispered, glancing between the soldiers and the regulars who had watched this unfold. "I just couldn't watch a child go hungry." Colonel Daniels gave a small nod, his jaw tight. "That's why we're here." Behind the counter, Tom emerged from the kitchen, his usual gruffness softened. He looked between Linda and the soldiers, then quietly stepped aside as if acknowledging that no words were needed from him today. The moment stretched, a delicate, reverent pause, before the colonel lowered his salute. He reached out gently, resting a hand over Linda's for just a second, then turned sharply on his heel. The soldiers followed, their boots clicking softly against the tiled floor as they exited. Outside, the SUVs waited, engines idling. The soldiers climbed in, doors shutting with the weight of ceremony, and just like that, they were gone. Inside the diner, the silence lingered a moment longer before the world gradually returned. Forks lowered, mugs lifted, quiet conversation stirred, but something in the air had shifted, as if the walls of Maplewood Diner now carried a story that would never quite fade. Linda turned back toward the counter, her fingers brushing over the envelope once more, then looked at the corner booth where Ethan had once sat. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest acts leave the deepest marks. In the days following the soldiers' visit, the Maplewood Diner was no longer just a quiet stop on Main Street. It became a place where people came not only for coffee and pancakes, but to remember what kindness looked like. Word spread fast. By that evening, photos of the soldiers standing outside the diner were all over local Facebook pages. The once mocking online posts transformed into words of admiration. "Bless Linda Parker." One post read, "Proof that small towns still have the biggest hearts." The next morning, Linda walked in to find something new, a small American flag placed near the corner booth. Tom was the one who had hung it, though he said nothing. Below the flag was a brass plaque, simple but powerful, reserved for those who serve and the families who wait. Customers started requesting seats near that booth, not for the view, but for the meaning it now carried. Veterans passing through town stopped, sometimes leaving patches or unit coins behind. Young families came in with wide eyed children who pointed to the flag and asked their parents why it was there. The change wasn't just in the customers, it was in the town. Margaret from the flower shop brought a small arrangement every week to place by the booth. Ed, who had once scoffed at Linda's quiet generosity, left a $20 bill on the counter without a word. Joe organized a fundraiser at the local VFW, raising money for a small emergency fund to help local families with a parent deployed overseas, a fund Linda quietly helped organize. Behind the scenes, Linda never saw herself as a hero. She still clocked in before sunrise, still poured coffee, still wiped down counters with the same quiet diligence, but something had shifted inside her, a quiet understanding that her small act of care had rippled outward, changing not only a boy's life, but the heartbeat of an entire town. As she moved through the diner, Linda would sometimes glance at the corner booth and smile softly. It was no longer just a table, it was a symbol, a reminder to the town and to herself that even the smallest kindness can echo farther than we ever imagined. As the seasons changed in Maplewood, Linda often found herself standing quietly by the corner booth, reflecting on all that had happened. She understood now that kindness is never wasted, it lingers, it spreads, and sometimes it circles back in ways we could never expect. In today's fast-moving world, it's easy to feel invisible, especially as we grow older, but Linda's story reminds us that simple acts, a warm meal, a kind word, an open seat, can leave a mark far beyond what we see. It also challenges us to think about the people we pass by every day, the quiet neighbor, the lonely child at the park, the veteran sitting at the bus stop. What would happen if we paused long enough to care? The Maplewood Diner didn't become a symbol of compassion because Linda set out to change the world. It happened because she chose to change one moment for one person again and again. As you reflect on this story, we invite you to share in the comments. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a small act of kindness that stayed with you? Or is there someone in your community you think needs a little extra care today? We'd love to hear your thoughts, and you might just inspire someone else watching. Thank you for joining us for this journey on Courageous Voices. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories that remind us of the power of simple goodness, because sometimes in a world that feels divided and rushed, it's the quietest acts of care that hold us all together.